probably many people, when they hear about Sweden, they have sorts of like romantic images of it, and maybe even kind of some myth circulates about the country, about how everything is turbulent, problematic. There are all sorts of crises happening everywhere, but in Sweden things are definitely fine. And I think the myths are kind of there in different communities. So also in the critical leftist communities, that's the degrowth one is, so they also somehow circulate. So we think that it would be very nice to start this conference by addressing these images and myths about Sweden in the context of the turbulent times and see if they can be problematized or substantiated. So, and this is what our speakers will do today. So I'm very happy that we have such a wonderful group of speakers here. So they are all very rooted in the local political activity, writing and activism. So, and I will introduce you one by one, and then I will give the word to each of you. So the format is that each speaker will have 10 minutes or so for the speech, and then we will have a round of questions, and we will figure out how to do it with the mic. So, Ellie, Cijvat, is part of Friends of the Earth, Malmö, Jordens vänner in Swedish. So, and I would say that whenever there are issues where justice or injustice is addressed at the local level, and you come to these events, and Ellie is really there. So, and with our event too, Ellie has become very involved in organizing the demonstration that I hope many of you, most of you, and ideally all of you will join. So a very warm welcome to Ellie Cijvat. So our next speaker is Daniel Sestrajcic from Up Left and Left Party of Sweden. So he is a former member of Parliament, and actually, together with Ellie, they co-organized the European Social Forum that was mentioned earlier, and that some people here are very familiar with. And with Daniel, when we started organizing the conference and faced the realities of the very kind of commercial and difficult process that it is, and that everything costs so much, and is so difficult to kind of even figure it out how you will manage to organize it and to fund it. So we met Daniel, and it was wonderful, because after meeting him and seeing him fountaineering with ideas, we thought, okay, the conference will actually happen, and now we are confident it is possible. So very warm welcome to Daniel. So, and our next speaker is Shora Esmailian. Shora is a journalist and writer, and she writes on a very broad range of issues. So, for example, she has written the only book in Swedish on climate refugees. She also covers topics like climate change, gender issues, and issues of migration. So, which I think very much echoes degrowth and this broad degrowth approach, and the kind of approach that is needed to address the multiple problems that we are facing, and which is what good journalism, I think, should look like. So, a very warm welcome to Shora. So, who will be first?
Obviously, we hadn't decided who was supposed to be talking first, but I'll start. My name is Ellie, as Katja introduced me. I'm a member of Friends of the Earth and quite active in Friends of the Earth. First of all, let me start by saying a little bit echoing what the introducers were saying about choosing Malmö. Malmö is a very diverse city, but it also has quite a strong activist culture. So I'm very glad that you chose Malmö to have the Degrowth Conference, and of course a very warm welcome to the city of Malmö. The challenges that we face in our city are numerous. We have challenges with regards to welfare, social security, healthcare, the school system. We have challenges with regards to finding jobs for everyone. Integration is a big issue. We also have challenges when it comes to traffic. And of course, as we are a city, we also have a problem with our environmental footprint. Cities are almost per definition not sustainable, so we have a long way to go there before we get sustainable living places. But let's look a little bit more to Sweden, broaden our perspective a little bit from our local level to the national level, and look at some more details. So is Sweden still the paradise that some want us to believe? As I said, I'm an activist. I'm working on environmental issues, and I'm working on migration issues, or volunteering, I should say. And so I have a perspective of both, and I actively see what is happening with the environment in Sweden and what is happening with migration issues. And believe me, a lot is happening there, not to the better. In Sweden, we have rising inequalities. I think from all OECD countries, Sweden has the largest rise in inequality economically. We also have an enormous urbanization. So we have people moving from the countryside to the cities. And that causes trouble on the countryside, that causes trouble producing the food that we need, for instance. We need a sustainable countryside as well. But as we see it now, we see an enormous urbanization instead. We also see a power imbalance. We see that between the countryside and the cities. Decisions are made in the cities, while the people on the countryside feel like they are only supplying natural resources and not much else. They don't have power over natural resources, really. We also see a power imbalance within the cities, of course. There's a power imbalance between the people in the center and the people in the periphery, the people in the suburbs. So as an environmental activist, I work sometimes on those issues, countryside, city, and try to unite the struggles, because you see the same power imbalance in both places. What we see in Sweden, and I'll come back to that a little bit later, is also that our society is actually a capitalist society and has been so for a long time. It's a capitalist society, maybe with an old socialist face, but in principle it's quite neoliberal. There's numerous examples of that, but Sweden usually is the best pupil in class when it comes to implementing neoliberal strategies. Sweden is one of the best in deregulating the public sector. Our school system is deregulated. Our trains are deregulated. The mail, etc., etc. What we see from this neoliberal society and the inequalities that are rising is that we see turmoil, we see people are left behind. We also have created a society based on the 2/3 principle. I don't know how many of you are aware of the 2/3 principle. Hands up. Few, good. Basically it means that 2/3 of the population will be kept happy. They will get reduced taxes, etc., etc., while 1/3 of the population has to pay for that. So social benefits are decreased, etc. So 1/3 of the population is left behind. But the 2/3 are enough to keep a government in place. So we see increased turmoil in our society. We see increased racism. We see scapegoating of immigrants. And we also see an increased resource consumption, even though we may have exported our consumption. We are importing goods from countries like China or India. So the resource consumption over there is enormous, while we sort of can claim, oh, look at our emissions, they are decreasing, but that's only half the truth. If you look at our consumption, our emissions are not decreasing at all. So that is the picture of Sweden. When it comes to climate, Sweden was recently ranked #1, like the best country in climate policy. But I guess that tells us more about the other countries than it actually tells us about Sweden. We still continue to build motorways, even though we know that we should stop emitting fossil fuels. We know that traffic is unsustainable. We neglect the train track maintenance as one big example of the deregulated system. So deregulated train maintenance or track maintenance means that no one is responsible. And that is typical for, I think, for the Swedish society today. We focus a lot on so-called solutions, such as biofuels, forgetting the global impacts of that, forgetting the way small farmers are hurt by that sometimes, or quite often. We promote industrial agriculture, a totally unsustainable way of providing our food. And Sweden has exported its very capital-intensive forestry industry. So our forest system is not based on sustainable use of the forests. It's clear-cutting and trying to get as much money out of it as possible. We also have a large mining industry, extracting the natural resources from the earth. So those are the environmental issues, and I hope I'm giving you a little bit more realistic picture of Sweden in that perspective. If we look at migration, then, we are one of the first countries in 2015 to close its border. The internal EU border was closed. We are one of the least generous migration policies in the EU, also changed after 2015. We changed to a migration policy where we have almost no permanent residence permits. We have a migration policy where the treatment of especially Afghan youngsters, young people from Afghanistan, unaccompanied minors, so-called, is way beyond me. So Sweden is so far from being a human rights champion at this point. Medical tests that are very doubtful are performed. Reasons for fleeing the home countries are not believed, etc., etc. So what can we do? It's a good question, and I guess it's quite an important question to try and find some answers for this week. We know that economic growth is not sustainable. We cannot consume ourselves towards sustainability. I think I don't have to explain that in this crowd. We have a linear relation between growth and resource consumption, and if some gains are made, then we have the famous rebound effect, consuming all gains that are made and still emitting a lot of greenhouse gases, etc. But then the question is degrowth the solution? And personally, maybe I'm not all that convinced actually that degrowth is the solution. Because in itself, I mean, in theory, you could have growth and still achieve sustainable societies. You could have growth in some sectors. For instance, in sustainable food production, it would be quite nice to have growth, etc., etc. But as a first comment to the question, is degrowth the solution? Let's say that we are fast approaching a point of no return. We are at a crossing. Do we have ordered degrowth, or do we have chaotic degrowth? We heard that we have a world in crisis. We saw climate change happening that has been ongoing for a number of years, of course, as we know. So will we get chaotic degrowth and more crisis, or will we try to achieve ordered degrowth to try and reduce the impact of those crises? So presuming that we have ordered degrowth, maybe if we look from an ecological perspective, degrowth would mean less resource consumption, quite good, more sustainable, maybe more recycling, a circular economy. If we look at degrowth from a social perspective, then we need to make quite sure, I think, that degrowth is not at the expense of the poor. We need to think of that nationally, but we also need to think of that globally. From an economic perspective, if we look at degrowth, we have quite a few alternatives. We can find alternatives for BNP, or the gross national product, I should say in English. We can change the banking system, or at least have proposals to change the banking systems. But our opponents are quite powerful. It's not that easy to make a system change in that respect. What we need as movements, and now I'm talking as an activist, I think we need a vision, or actually a multitude of visions, for a good life for all. A good life that is inclusive and diverse, with gender equality, with human rights, but also within the planetary boundaries. And that sounds a little bit fluffy, right? Human rights and a good life for all, but it's actually a necessity, I think, for all of us. So it's worth fighting for all of us, whether we live in the north or the south. So we need to make people more aware of that. And then the next question, or the last question, is actually a little bit of a Malmö perspective again. Is the Malmö activist scene strong enough to try and take responsibility for these questions, at least at the local level? It's a tough battle. I mean, we have elections coming up in Sweden. We see right-wing parties. We see increasing racism. So it's quite a tough situation. And also one can question, can we take the fight for climate justice? Can we take the fight for migration solidarity? It is quite tough, but we do our best, definitely. So I hope you will get some inspiration this week, and that we, as activists, also academics, and even politicians can pick up the fight for justice and a good life for all. Thank you.
Yeah. Hello, everybody. And thank you, Ellie, for your words. It's always nice to hear you. We have been active in this city for a long time together, many of us. And firstly, I would like to say a very big welcome to Malmö. It's a wonderful city, even with all its problems. And in activist circles, and when we fight for refugees or for changes, we often call ourselves the capital of activists and resistance. So it's a very good city that you have reached if you are for changing the world, changing for the better, and giving all that you got to create another world. And I'm in love with Malmö, with all its problems that we have. I'm really in love with this city, and I'm happy that you are here to share that. And then before I give my speech, I also would like to thank the organizers. One of the big things for me because I didn't know about this movement before I met the organizers, before they asked for meeting with me, because I've organized a lot in this city. And one of the big things for me was this multitude of ideas and building alliances and discussing together on multiple levels how we could change the world and how we could be active together. Because I think that change is only coming from below. It can never come from above. It can only come from below. And I say that as being an activist for 25 years, but the last 4 years being a member of the national parliament for the left party. So I'm also a politician. Don't blame me for that. Activist is better. Okay, now I will say I'm sorry for my bad English before. I hope you understand me and the things I want to förmedla, convey to you. And the question is, what is Sweden and what is Malmö? And often when I travel around, I hear about this fantastic, great nation that I live in. And I feel like, what? It's not like that. But on the other hand, it's not that bad either. Because what is going on here is a battle between ideas and material situations about which country and city we would like to have. And on one hand, this country has been built by the working class movement that is manifested in this park, for example, and in this city. That has given us welfare society, that has given us right for everybody to vote, that has given us an advanced society with lots of basic and advanced social rights and social benefits. And this society has a lot of problems with inclusion, with concentration of power, both political and economical, with a model that have been prioritizing the richest people for a long time. But it has also been a progressive country with low income inequalities and a pretty stable system taking care of its inhabitants and moving forward. And it has also been a country where we could have very broad discussions about how to solve problems in the world and how to handle complex challenges. But on the other hand, this society that has been good, because I don't think it's that good anymore, is a capitalist country in chaos, as many countries around the world is right now. And that country has changed a lot. And the era of neoliberalism that we have lived through has also hit both Malmö and Sweden. And especially Malmö, with all its problems of poverty and unemployment and so on, has been hit by these neoliberal ideas and strategies. And this neoliberalism, we can talk a long time about that, but this neoliberalism has implemented a profit-driven market model with a lot of privatization and a lot of growing vast inequalities, as Ellie very carefully explained. And actually, Sweden is one of the countries who is getting more and more and more billionaires. And people outside Sweden and the rich people in Sweden, they say, you have so high taxes. But we have a tax system that actually is providing more and more money for a few people and taking it from the poor people. I would say that it's this billionaires, the picture of the billionaires anyway, that is destroying our planet and is creating a stressful society. Their demands of what the society should be. And where we have been put in a cage where we have work, consume, be happy capitalism. And that kind of capitalism is destroying us as human beings and our environment and our planet. So let's not be fooled. This market-driven country where everything now is for sale, even schools, hospitals and elder care, is something that the market has taken big chunks of, where we are indeed closing borders out of economical arguments often, and are out of fear created by the right wing, but also by a social democratic party and government. And we have seen a lot of cuts in social welfare. But the picture is not only dark, because there is struggle and there is resistance, and there is still left very much of the Swedish model that is worth defending and expanding. Another big problem with the market model is what it is doing to our democracy. And the democracy that the market model is demanding from us as individuals is that we should influence politics and societies with our money and by our feet, moving from school to school in search for the best school for our kids, for example, instead of staying, being active, being engaged, and trying to together solve the problems that we stand before. And in my eyes, a real participation that will create real democracy. And who should have the biggest influence? Is it the big corporations and their money, or is it us, the people? And this problem is at the center of a market-driven society when we talk about the issue of democracy, that I also think is really important. But all of this could, of course, change, because we have changed so many things in man in the history of human beings. Before I talk a little bit about the changes that I see, or who is the driving force for the changes, I would also like to say, and I think that all of you know this, but this is a debate that I think is needed to be taken outside these circles. And this is that the market-driven model is never a solution to our times and the challenges and problems we have. The market-driven model is the root of the problem. They are creating and drives the problem. That is why we need movements that are pointing in another direction, that are giving us another idea and model of how to organize and create our society. Today, we are in an election cycle here in Sweden, and we can clearly see, both today and earlier, the polarization in the society and in the discussion. And many people think that's a bad thing, the polarization. I don't think it's a bad thing with the polarization. I don't like that the right wing and the extreme right is having the upper hand in that polarization right now. We have to fight that. Because they are demanding, and this is not only the extreme right, it's also the right-wing parties, they are demanding more privatization, close the borders, cut the welfare system, and downsize the state. They are creating suspicion over people like immigrants, but not only immigrants, also the poor people, the lesser-off people. We are all a problem for this kind of politics. But on the other hand, I can see, and I am sitting myself in a phone bank calling voters, and I can see and I can hear that there is a shift in the discussion. There is shifting in many places in the discussion. And a lot of people are mobilized and have had enough of these ideas that the right wing is supplying us with, and they are mobilizing in defense of human rights. A lot of people are questioning the system's idea about how to live and be happy. What is to be happy? And are forming alternatives that, for example, includes shortening of the working hours, heavy investment in things that makes a society just and fair to all. For example, culture, good schools, good care, and so on. It includes a shifting in perspective and a redistribution of power from the powerful to the powerless, from the rich to the not so rich ordinary people. So how could we come and how could we, how do you say, understödja? Support these ideas. Of course we can discuss them, we can be a part of the movements, and I'm a firm believer of that the movements can change. It has changed the course of history before, and it can change the course of history. So this polarization, it's a very good, even if it's the right-wing agenda right now. So with this polarization, we can question the system. And it's going to help us to build new movements, stronger movements, both in Malmö, nationally, internationally, and globally. And what we need to see, I think, is a multitude of movements and organizations that are mobilized and that are creating ideas from below. Experiments, ideas, how to live, what we can do, and so on. And of course, big alliances between old movements and new movements. If we don't do this, if we don't act to this alarming situation by building these movements, the elite will still be able to blame immigrants, poor people, and people from in other countries for the problem we are also responsible for. Because they have a lot of money, they have a lot of think tanks, and their power will help them to keep the market-driven society instead of building a new society. And it's obvious for me, that we need a deep system change where other visions are in place, like those visions that Ellie talked about the good life. And it's also obvious for me that we can create this change. So let me repeat the words. It's only movements and organized people in the streets and the workplaces that can change politics and system. On a global scale, we are of course the upper class. Everybody here is the upper class in a global scale. But in every country, there is a global south and a global east. In every country, there is a heavy class differences. Those differences can only be solved with politics that includes the people at the bottom and find solutions for the problems in our life and their lives. Good housing that are sustainable, good working conditions, good social conditions, and so on, to be able to create a society that is not demanding growth from us. And we need to see that it's not the people in the bottom that is the problem, and that the solution in different crises we live in right now is not to attack them, but via politics attack the local and global power elites instead. In this question about what kind of society we want to build and who should run that society, I'm a firm believer about a couple of things. In a society with democracy that is also expanded to the economical sector and deepened in everybody's lives so everybody could be a participator. I'm a firm believer in a society who is built around ordinary people's needs at its core and not a profit-driven market society. I'm a firm believer of a society where we work and stress less, instead get the chance to have a better quality of life, where we can take control over our own lives and be a little part of the change that we need. This demands another system, because that system can't be capitalism, which is right now destroying us, the planet, and our future. It is possible and is necessary to resist this system, both in Sweden and worldwide, and it is possible to create and dream of a totally different future, even if the power is telling us not to do. Let's start doing that. Let's start doing that this week, and doing it again, what people have showed us in history. To change the world is possible and necessary, and it can only be done by movements, and they have been done before us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniel and Ellie, for excellent presentations. Thank you to the organizers for inviting me here. This is actually my favorite place in Malmö. I'm here almost daily with my 4-year-old daughter, playing here, but you can also drink a beer or meet friends here. I think Folkets Park is maybe the heart of Malmö, where you meet people from all over Malmö. If you go to a playground in Western Malmö, you see just a special class of people. If you go to Eastern playground in Malmö, you see only some sort of people. But here in Folkets Park, you actually see a lot of different people of Malmö. So thank you for letting me speak here. I don't know if I have so much more to add to these two good presentations, but I wanted to more focus on racism in Sweden and the borders and what happened the autumn of 2015. I don't know how many of you were in Sweden autumn of 2015. Okay, so a lot of you weren't here. How many of you do remember Alan Kurdi, the 3-year-old boy who died in the Mediterranean? A lot of you. So when that picture reached us in Sweden, a lot of Swedes went out to the streets, to the train stations, to the bus stations to show their solidarity. People who hadn't been engaged in political issues suddenly were holding signs saying refugees welcome, helping to drive them from the train station to different places they needed to be. People went home and got diapers, clothes, food.
a lot of different things for all these people that were fleeing mostly Syria, desperate people, refugees coming to Sweden. I was so warm in my body, feeling that I'm now very proud to live in this country, proud to be a part of this movement. And a lot of times I wonder, what had happened with Sweden if a lot of people wouldn't have gone out in this huge solidarity? Because only some months after this show of solidarity, our politicians decided to close the borders. Would we have had real fascism here if we didn't have that solidarity? So when I get a bit depressed about closing borders, I try to soothe myself in thinking that there are a lot of people in this country that doesn't want these policies that we have now. So people were had a lot of solidarity, people were generous, but the politicians decided to close the borders. Social Democrats, together with the Green Party, took that decision. And today, we are not longer a country with generous immigration policies. The borders were first closed not so far from here, at the next station called Hyllie. And Malmö was also a place where a lot of people came. Me, myself, came to Sweden, also here in southern Sweden, Ystad, so it was a very emotional time. But since many years, especially since 2010, the GDP of Sweden has grown, but this fact doesn't matter in the decision of closing the borders. Our Prime Minister said that Sweden was seriously on the brink of collapsing. The system was going to collapse if we would take in more refugees. The country that have seen a steady growing GDP since the 60s, with two small exceptions in 92 and 2010. So we had an economy going like this, but we cannot afford to take in more refugees. So why did they close the borders, and why are they still closed while people still are fleeing wars and climate-induced conflicts? Why did Sweden change the laws and stopped giving permanent residency rights at all? Anybody that comes to Sweden can get a permanent residency anymore. The longest you can get a residency is 3 years, and you cannot build a life 3 years on 3 years on 3 years. You cannot build a future. You could do the analysis that the winds are changing in Sweden like in the rest of Europe, that Swedish Democrats, the racist party in Sweden, are setting the agenda, making other parties move to the right, that social democracy in Europe lacks a spine without any policies of themselves. But and that is a correct analysis, I'm not disagreeing, but it's also about, both in Sweden and the rest of rich countries, is that closing borders is a strategy to prevent people from the periphery from coming here and benefiting from the wealth that has been accumulated at the expense of the same people in the periphery. But also within this country, in the city of Malmö, as Daniel and Ellie has been talking about, it isn't the poor people getting a better life, even though we have this strong economy. It's the rich people becoming even more richer. And the city of Malmö is a very good example. I recommend you to take bus number 5 from one side of the city to the other side. You can take it from western side, where it's the eastern side, where it's very poor, and you can go all the way to western side, where it's very rich. And all the wealth is concentrated in the western side of the city, for example in Västra Hamnen, one of the end stops of the bus. And the poor families of Rosengård or Almgården on the east side of the city, they don't share the wealth of Malmö. The politicians in the city, they like to talk about increased growth how much wealth we have in this city, but this is not anything that trickles down to the poor population of Malmö. The rich are becoming richer, also securing the wealth by, for example, building gated communities in the western part of the city, or making it more difficult for people, poor people, coming to the western parts of the city. For example, once again, Västra Hamnen, where the rich people doesn't want the youngsters from East Malmö coming, bathing, or being loud or partying. Sweden has an excluding growth, and both within the city and in the whole country, but also when it comes to immigration and not welcoming refugees. The closing of the borders was all about defending these achievements, for example, welfare, instead of sharing it with people in need. This summer, we had one of the warmest summer, or maybe the warmest summer in Sweden and globally as well. I was in the Stockholm archipelago, where all the blueberry, you couldn't find a single blueberry, because in mid-July, the blueberry plants were already yellow, as they used to be in September. It's been drought. You haven't been allowed to make fires. You haven't been allowed to grill your food outside in the parks, for example, here. It's been extremely hot. A lot of old people and a lot of children has been suffering. And this heat has all something to do with global warming, of course. Not that it's shown in Swedish media, unfortunately. But all of this is because of the growth based on fossil fuels that are making some parts of this planet impossible to live in. I don't know if you heard about the monsoons at the moment, killing hundreds of people in India. I was in Pakistan 6 months after the monsoon that made 20 million people flee their homes. And this is 8 years ago. And now again we are seeing very extreme monsoon rains, making people having to flee, making people, killing people. This is of course making something called climate refugees, people that cannot live where they used to live, people who have to move because they don't have a choice anymore. And the first and foremost people that are having to flee, of course, is not here in Sweden. We had a heat, we had a lot of farmers that couldn't harvest enough. They had to send their animals to slaughter because they didn't have food for them, they didn't have enough grass. But we are not suffering from food deficit in Sweden. We are not starving here. But when something like this happens in Western or Eastern Africa, people actually are starving and has to move. They are the most vulnerable people of this planet, and what we are doing is instead closing the borders in their faces and saying you're not welcome. So I think that defending the borders of the rich countries under these circumstances, where we have a warming world with wars, conflicts and climate refugees, is actually to participate in the killing of desperate people fleeing over the Mediterranean like Alan Kurdi. But on the other hand, to open them is actually to pay off the rich countries' ecological debt, but it's also to level out the prosperity that is made on the backs of the people that lives in the world's periphery. And to do that, you're all needed. Thank you.
Thanks so much to our speakers for such rich, nuanced and powerful introductions into the context of the conference and the theme of the conference. So, and now we have some time for questions. So, yeah, anyone who would like to start? Raise your hand and we have a few mics circulating here. Yeah.
Hello, I'm Pierre, coming from Italy. In my country, all the documentary videos about domestic problems finish describing the situation in Sweden or in Germany as their situation. I've heard about the new the regulation about the education system, about the schools. I would like to know if, as it's described by us, it's a real opportunity also for libertarian schools, autonomous schools organized by below, or it's just an help for expensive private schools. Thank you.
If I understood the question right, it was about the free system of choosing schools and if that gives opportunity to have a better school system for more progressive ideas and so on. And I would say absolutely no. It was sold to us as an idea of having this very nice progressive education system where alternative could grow. But what is in reality happening here is that big corporations have a lot of schools that is money driven and that is extortion of the money from the taxpayers and that they take out in profit. That is what really is happening. And I don't say everywhere, because of course there is some schools that have been benefiting out of this and doing good models. I myself think that you could have this without the free school system inside the organized school system of the society. And the second thing that the free school system has done is that it has put the school in a market-driven idea, in a market-driven society that creates a lot of problems with segregation. It creates a lot of problems about failing schools, and it creates problems of this extorting the profit from it. So I would say, and especially in poor cities, the free school election is, what should you say, it's an illusion. Yeah, it's an illusion. It's not a real choice. And today, actually, I would say that all the, most of the experts and people researching this would say shut down the free school system. But it's a very, ideological driven idea from the right wing in Sweden that has motivated this, and that is talking about this free choice that is non-existing for most people. That's my view, and I think many's.
Just to add to that, I think it used to be Chile and Sweden that had a deregulated school system, and now it's only Sweden that has a deregulated school system. So I think we should learn a lesson from the rest of the world and maybe not deregulate as much.
I think there was a question there. Yep.
Yes, I'm Daniel Pargman from Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. I have a question. So all the three speakers have a very clear green or left political stance. And it just, I haven't really thought about it before, but like if you turned every stone, would it be possible to find people who are in the middle of the political spectrum or even on the right who would agree with some parts of degrowth? Do you think?
Who would like to address this question? Who would like to start?
Oh, I think actually, yeah, there are some people. There's a couple of examples actually. One example at least that comes to mind. That's Anders Wijkman. So he used to be a right-wing politician from a party called Moderaterna. Kristdemokraterna. Okay, the Christian Democrats. And he's maybe one of the few that actually would support the agenda of degrowth. But in general, I think it's hard to find. I mean, one of the issues that we addressed a little bit in the previous question was the ideology that is so present in, for instance, the deregulation discussion. And I think that's common in politics in Sweden in general. So the ideology is so strong that people don't, on the right side of the political spectrum, they don't dare to question growth, unfortunately. That's my take on it.
We agree.
Thank you. So there is also a question there at the back. And we need more questions, not only from men.
Yeah, sorry for being men. My name is Volker Maufer from University of Vienna and Meiji University in Japan. I have a question to all the three speakers. It's about the relationship between top-down measures and bottom-up measures towards degrowth. How do you see this relationship, and what would you consider as typical top-down measures and typical bottom-up measures which could contribute to degrowth? Thank you.
Who would like to start?
I think this is a hard question, because as an activist, and if I understood your question right, is how do degrowth come? How do we change society in right direction? And I always think that movements need to be at the core of changing, and that ideas need, and that it has to come from below, because as politicians, a lot of politicians has a lot of good ideas, but they are also caged in the society that we are in, and what the ideological time gives us possibility to think. And then you need to have movements from the below to pressure and to give other answers. Do you understand how I mean? So in that way, I think that change always need to come from below, and ideas need to created in the below, and that a big thing for us is to be movement builders, to be educators, to be out in the communities and talking and speaking and organizing for ordinary people's rights and for a different society. But then, of course, if we get the right policies in place, that could also come from above. But often the right policies in place comes when movements are demanding them. So my answer would be that we should shoot from changing from below and pressing up and taking power. That's my answer to that.
I agree with a lot of what you said, but the problem with climate change is that we have so little time. So, and the more we wait, the more we have to have top-down solutions, yeah? We have to make people stop flying. We cannot just have a tax. Obviously, it doesn't work because there are still a lot of rich people that would fly. So we have to make them. So that would be one top-down policy that you actually have to do to have a planet to live on.
I think another, I agree with Shora and Daniel. I think we are a panel of quite agreeing speakers, to put it mildly. Slightly different take on the bottom-up and top-down approach would be that as a bottom-up, you could actually start implementing alternatives on a smaller scale, and that could be alternatives like local currencies. It could be starting a collective for growing your own food, for having consumer producers contacts, etc. So trying to not support the markets in different alternatives. And maybe as examples of top-down, I think, yeah, forbidding the take-up of fossil fuels would be like quite a good thing to have from top.
But if I could comment on that idea, it will never happen from top down. Look at the politicians now. Do you see a top-down decision in the parliament today that will implement that? For that, you need a movement from below, pressing, and I know that you agree with me, but you need the movement from below demanding this. So I never think that consuming in another way, you should change your own patterns, but that's not the solution. Politics, movements, and those things are the solution.
Choosing your own patterns is a part of the movement.
Yeah.
Thank you. So I can see 2 more questions, and I think we have 5 minutes remaining, so let's collect them. And anyone else who wants to ask a question, so I can see 2 hands. Anyone else? Yeah. Okay, so let's collect 3 questions, and the speakers will address them all.
Is this working? Oh yeah, it's working. I'm Anastasia. I'm an environment policy student, and I'm wondering about basic income experiments in Sweden. I know you mentioned working time reduction, and I know about the places and companies doing that. And I'm wondering if there are any city councils or any top-down plans in the future for basic income in Sweden.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Yes. Half past. We're finishing. Yeah. Yes. There was a question in the middle.
Hi, I'm Ruth Elliot Blomqvist, and I'm from Sweden. I just want to bring this up because the organizers, I know that they were interested in having someone from the indigenous Sami population here for the opening event. And I think for me, at least, when I started to realize that this fairy tale idea of Sweden wasn't entirely true, that was when I learned about the colonial history of Sweden and how the north was colonized. So I think that's something that you maybe want to comment on in relation to borders and peripheries and the countryside.
Yeah, and there was one more question here at the front. So, yeah, and then we pass the microphone to the speakers.
Hello. Yeah, we have democracy. Do you think that our education is sufficient for our voter and our member citizens to take the democratic responsibility? All the problems you have mentioned here is promoted by the people, by the voters who drive the politicians in front of them. I think it is wrong to blame the politicians for the problems we have. The problems is induced by our voters and citizens. Thank you.
Thank you. So we should be finishing shortly, so I would like the speakers to pick the questions that you would like to address and then be as short and concise as possible. I can already hear music in the background.
Okay, we divided the questions here among us. So about the indigenous people, to be a part of the movement, did I understand the question right? That they need to be a part of the movement for change? They should be mentioned, yes. Yes, of course. Sweden has a big indigenous population, the Sami people. And of course that they should be mentioned because they are a big part of the movement, especially against big corporations that are taking out natural resources in northern Sweden, where they live and where they work. And it's just look at other countries, for example, North America, where the indigenous people are also a big part of the movement, making big changes. For example, Standing Rock, where it wasn't only about sacred places or water, but also about climate change and holding fossil fuels in the ground. So yeah, you're definitely right.
When it comes to the question on that we should, if I understood it correctly, not blaming politicians maybe, but blaming the citizens. Of course, that's a valid point. I think the saying is that you get the politicians you deserve, in a way. So we as citizens should be more proactive, definitely. However, we shouldn't forget that politicians also have a responsibility. Which groups do they listen to? What social media do they listen to? So it's not maybe as black and white as saying that it's only the citizens' fault. It's I think it's a combination. Citizens putting not enough pressure, and that's a typical, actually, sort of property of Sweden. I think that citizens have such a trust in the goodness of the state that they don't really protest a lot. So actually in Sweden we have quite a lot to learn as Swedish citizens from other countries. But yeah, otherwise I think it's not as black and white, and it's a complicated picture. Also the media plays a big role in what the media portrays, etc., etc.
And to the question about shortening the working hours, the working time, in Sweden there has been numerous tries. Most known is that in Gothenburg, but there is also in other parts, especially in the hospitals, where they implemented shortening of working hours. It's not on a mass scale, but it's pretty many now. And also in private industries, there is some private industries doing this. And 20 years ago, this was a really big question in Sweden, and there was really many tries, but then it was buried. And again, today is coming back, and I think it's coming back because that we live in a time that is very stressful, that is very demanding, and we have a lot of people standing outside of the system, and we have a lot of workplaces where you simply won't stay because it's too hard to work with those schedules and so on. So this is a reform that is more and more urged, and that is more and more asked for, but by many people and by several unions and parties and so on. So it's a reform for the future that will come, if not next year or next year after that. In a near future, this reform will come. And for me, it's a very important reform because it's a reform that questions the system in multiple ways, and that is redistributing the profits, not to go to the companies, but to be taken out for us, the people who work for the profits, who create the profits. And I think that it also will mean a shift in thinking. What is worth living for? Is it for the work, or is it for maybe creating something else? So I hope I answered your question. It's not on a mass scale in Sweden, but I hope it soon will be, and it's a very, very important reform that we all should fight for, because it's taking power from capital and giving it back to people. Thank you.